Piers Morgan is famously a big advocate for free speech, but evidently he's also more than happy to take money from Saudi Arabia, where criticism of the monarchy or Islam is against the law.
I was delighted to take part in the Real Estate Forum 2025. It was an impeccably organised and superbly staged event that delivered real value. That's exactly why I've decided to return for a second year. RFF 2026 will be the first major gathering since the important new law which allows non-Saudis to own real estate in the kingdom. It's going to be a vital platform for leading companies, investors and experts to connect and discuss the future of global real estate. My sincere thanks to the organisers for inviting me back again. I look forward to joining you at RFF 2026.
Now, I think that's quite embarrassing for someone who sort of claims to be a serious journalist. We're sort of used to hearing it on like YouTube shows and podcasts where someone says something which you can imagine they were paid to say, right? I'm not sure he wrote the entire script. Maybe he did. But I did find it jarring the way he's implying he's just going back because it was so enjoyable the last time. It was brilliant. So I was so glad to be invited because I want to go to this really brilliant real estate selling event in this sort of Arab monarchy. Presumably, the reason he's keen is because I would imagine they pay quite well. Again, doing it on the set of his YouTube show, I think cheapens the journalistic credibility of that outfit if it had any already. And obviously, this fits into an aggressive campaign by the Saudis to broaden their appeal in the West. Just 2 weeks ago, that included the very controversial Riyadh Comedy Festival, which managed to draw in some of the world's most famous comedians, reportedly with seven-figure payments for some. Once again, the festival managed to sort of draw in people who've very publicly complained about cancel culture and limits to free speech, like Dave Chappelle, Jimmy Carr, and Louis C.K. In response to these stars performing, Human Rights Watch highlighted how the Saudi regime had recently been on an execution spree to crush dissent and people speaking out about what they believe. Now, they highlighted two cases in particular. So they say, on June the 14th this year, the Saudi government executed Turku al-Jasser, a prominent Saudi writer and journalist, for various terrorist crimes. So that's in brackets, of course, not brackets in quote marks. And the government has released few details about his detention, trial and execution. And it appears he faced capital punishment because of his peaceful speech and commentary. They say in February 2024, Saudi authorities executed Abdullah al-Shamri, a Saudi political analyst specializing in Turkey, based on charges including threatening the stability and endangering the security of Saudi Arabia. Al-Shamri met regularly with journalists from prominent news outlets and had appeared as a political commentator on television. Barry, obviously these comedians got a lot of criticism for going to Saudi Arabia to take part in this comedy festival, getting paid lots of money, given that telling jokes about the royal family in Saudi Arabia is illegal, and these are often sort of comedians who've made a big deal out of the fact that they believe in free speech and they're getting cancelled because people are saying mean things about them on Twitter when they sort of make a joke about a minority. I haven't seen so much pushback for Piers Morgan. I mean, that video on Twitter did get quite a lot of views, but I was expecting loads of people to be really furious about it. And he seems to have gotten away with it. It seems to have gone under the radar. What do you think?
Well, yeah, for me, it's just a question of hypocrisy. I do want to say that I do think that there sometimes is a little bit of hypocrisy in the West towards countries in the Arab world or authoritarian regimes where you say, well, how could you take money from this government? But, it's completely fine to take money from the US government that is supporting a genocide in Gaza right now. But putting that aside, I think that, again, yes, it's about hypocrisy. The Saudi government is, for my money, one of the nastiest governments in the world. Last week, we had the 7th anniversary of the killing and dismembering of the journalist and dissident Jamal al-Khashoggi. And let's remember the extreme nature of that killing, where the man was lured into an embassy where basically a hit squad were waiting, who attacked him and chopped him up with a bone saw. I mean, this is the kind of government that we're dealing with. They execute opponents. They have executed opponents for years, and they continue to execute opponents. I think they're the third most prolific country for putting people to death. And yes, Piers Morgan sets himself up as some kind of a champion of free speech. The hypocrisy there is absolutely glaring. And, you know, I do think that he deserves more scrutiny for it. And I do think that he should be made to answer questions about it. I will say that when it comes to the sports washing, I believe he did do an interview with the Saudi sports minister earlier this year, in which he asked him some tough questions. You know, he asked him about freedom of expression. He asked him whether, you know, their moves into football and their moves into boxing were attempts to burnish their image, etc. But you know, he does an interview that I'm sure he would probably show as an example that he is willing to hold them to account. But then he takes their coin to go and do this event. And like you said, I'm sure it's a really, really nice amount of money. Same with the comedians. I don't think I've ever seen a comedy festival with a lineup of that level of comedians, you know, comedians of that fame all on one bill. Again, you can only imagine that serious money was thrown at them. So yeah, for me, it's about hypocrisy. Look, if you're a free speech warrior, if you talk about cancel culture, and then in the next breath you go and take money from a country that puts critics to death, then yeah, it's wildly hypocritical.
And I suppose to avoid us being seen as hypocrites, I wanted to get your thoughts on something, because I suppose I took money last week from Al Jazeera because I appeared on one of their shows to talk about Keir Starmer and British politics. You were an editor there. Qatar is another Gulf monarchy. They've got no democracy. We believe in democracy. They don't have it. I don't think it's a particularly great place to be LGBT, for example. Do we have a leg to stand on to criticize Piers Morgan or Dave Chappelle if we've been involved in Al Jazeera, say?
Well, people can criticize us for working for Al Jazeera, and they do daily criticize me on Twitter for that and call me a hypocrite. But, you know, Al Jazeera is a state-funded broadcaster, and I've always maintained that it's a state-funded broadcaster in much the way that the BBC is a state-funded broadcaster. I know that the BBC loves to, you know, draw a distinction between being a state-funded broadcaster and a public broadcaster. You know, we're not funded by the state, we're funded by the British public. Yeah, because it's illegal for the British public not to pay the license fee. It's not like they're voluntarily paying it out of the goodness of their heart. Therefore, it's state funded in the same way as Al Jazeera is state funded. BBC is Ofcom regulated. Al Jazeera, not many people know, is also Ofcom regulated. So I think as a journalist, you need to look at whether the news organization that is state funded actually holds that state to account. And I think that the probably the biggest human rights criticism that you can make of Qatar is the treatment of migrant workers there over the years, and you know, particularly in the run up to the World Cup, when there were major infrastructure projects underway and the construction of the stadiums. And when I worked at Al Jazeera, we covered that. Similarly, you know, you would hold the BBC to a similar standard. Does the BBC hold the British government to account? A lot of people would say that they do, and they do so very effectively. And I think a lot of people would say that they don't. And a lot of people would point to the coverage of Israel, for example, of Israel's genocide in Gaza as an example of how the BBC toes the British government line. So, yeah, again, I think the key issue with Piers Morgan and the key issue with the comedians is the hypocrisy and the fact that the Saudi regime is clearly one of the nastiest in the world and anti-free speech to the degree that it puts people to death for criticizing the government.
Yeah, I suppose I would just want, like, out of interest, I suppose, because I'm, you know, I've appeared on Al Jazeera, but I'm interested in sort of how it works on the inside. Because my understanding is, and I suppose I'll put out my position as well, to be fair, which is I think Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera English sort of is good for media plurality, because I think that sort of it's good to have that perspective on Middle East politics being streamed. I actually do find that sometimes when I go on there, they really not want to, because that would be maybe overstating it, but I don't like going on there and sort of saying, oh, Keir Starmer's terrible because he's so harsh about migrants, etc. Because I do feel a bit like, well, I mean, the country that's paying for this broadcast is not very good to migrants either. So, like, I feel a bit awkward doing that, but I do think that on the whole, it's good for media plurality to have it, and the journalistic standards are obviously much higher than, say, Russia Today, for example. It doesn't feel like just a propaganda channel. It feels like the information is high quality and they employ good journalists.
Well, the proof is in the pudding, Michael. The proof is in the pudding. Switch on Al Jazeera English, go to aljazeera.com, and you will see an incredibly high standard of journalism. And I think that news journalists around the world recognize that. And I think that sometimes when, you'll see Al Jazeera being criticized by particular governments, you'll see journalists come out from across the spectrum, not just Al Jazeera journalists, but journalists who work at Reuters or AP or other places will come out and say, no, we actually respect the level of journalism that comes out of there. And yeah, unlike other state-funded channels like Russia Today or like Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera English is Ofcom regulated, and there have been complaints made to Ofcom about Al Jazeera. There was one about a documentary that Al Jazeera made on the Israeli lobby, and there were many, many complaints made to Ofcom about that documentary. Not a single one of them was upheld. So I think that, people just need to go and look at the level of journalism that it produces. And I think that a lot of people who criticize it do not read the journalism, do not watch the channel, just reflexively criticize it because it's funded by Qatar.
Are you allowed to criticize Qatar on it, though? Because you said my understanding had been that it's good on international politics, but the limit is you're not really allowed to talk about what's going on in Qatar. But maybe that's incorrect.
Well, you can. I mean, if you go on the Al Jazeera English website and search for Qatar, you're going to find a bunch of stories about migrant workers. I think that there is an element of self-censorship sometimes, where people are afraid that if they report too harshly on Qatar, they might rock the boat. But I often find or have found that self-censorship that you find from some journalists there is not necessarily valid. That when you do report on Qatar, generally, you have the freedom to do so. And again, I don't think that that's necessarily different from organizations like the BBC, where I think people also self-censor for an easy life. And I think that at any news organization worth its salt is full of journalists who will push back against any perceived biases that they might worry about at a senior level. And certainly Al Jazeera is a company or a news organization full of journalists who push back against their editors every single day. I can also point to an interview that Mehdi Hassan, when he was with Al Jazeera, did with the Qatari foreign minister, in which he put him massively under the cosh. So it's certainly not the case that Al Jazeera is banned from covering Qatar in a negative way.
That's very interesting. I like this comment from Mr. Squinty Mint. If you want to learn the truth about your own country, quite often you have to go to foreign broadcasters. I do think it is handy, actually, that sort of now British people or people from any country can more easily see what other people think of them or what other people think of the policies that their government have. I think maybe it would have been harder to go to the war in Iraq if as many people watched Al Jazeera back in 2003 as they do now, because it probably would have given people a different perspective. Maybe that's overstating the importance of these things, but I don't think it's a ridiculous sort of hypothesis to put forward. I'm always in favor of watching lots of different things. I always tell, don't just watch Novara Media, by the way. Watch Novara Media, watch some right-wing YouTubers, watch the BBC, watch Al Jazeera. As I say, I don't think Russia Today is particularly valuable, but watch lots of different things is I think the best way to get a good media diet and read as well.